All right. So good morning, everybody, and I want to thank Vivek and Wendy and everybody who arranged this just phenomenal meeting. It's so much fun to be here and to work with all of you, and very exciting for me. So I'm at Scripps Translational Science Institute. That is, we focus on two things: genomics and digital medicine. Our digital medicine arm was started 2 years ago. And I've been fortunate enough to be there for that 2 years and take it from a N of one department to a growing department. But we've learned a lot through the mistakes we've made, and we'll continue making mistakes as we develop trials along this area. I'm a clinician, and so the viewpoint I'm going to be sharing with you is really the clinical lessons and maybe things I wish I understood better as we first started doing more digital medicine-focused research. And it's in this short time, I try to make it just 20 minutes and then time for questions. I think the key points or learning points that I think it's important in working with clinicians and working in the clinical area of research. So let me start with some guiding principles. And this is something I learned when I had just finished my residency, and I had a patient tell me this, and it's resonated ever since. And I think it's one of the most important things to understand as we develop these technologies around that, is that patients don't like being reminded they have a chronic condition. Right, so we have, for those who are interested, one of the best papers I've seen actually came out a little bit over a week ago in this, and you can see the title, "You Get Reminded You're a Sick Person, Personal Data Tracking." And this is focused on individuals who we mainly want to focus a lot of digital medicine on, people with chronic conditions. So these are elderly individuals. And so in saying this, like I always think, the best interventions are in pregnant women or treating infectious diseases where it's a short-term focus. But when you really look at the big needs, so 85% of all healthcare costs are directed towards individuals with chronic conditions. So that's really the biggest unmet need in this area. And this quote is really good from the article, because I think it summarizes what most developers think when we talk to them, is that there's this assumption that if we just give patients all their data, everything will be great. And in reality, it could have potentially, for many, large percentage, have a very negative impact. So it's just something really important, I think, as a guiding principle when you think about your stuff and what you're developing and what you do, to keep this in mind, that the more passive you can make something. I was worried when Wendy heads down here. Oh, okay. I thought you were going to tackle me and take me off stage. Okay. I'm good.
That's my job.
Okay, good. Yeah. Aw, thank you. So this is, so I think this is really important to keep in mind, is this Steve Jobs quote, and if you replace customer with patient. And I think it happens, and it's not only in mHealth research, it's in all research. A lot of really smart people, like all of you in the room, we sit around and we go, let's design a trial, this is great, we're going to focus it on heart failure, or on asthma, or on post-MI patients. And no one sitting there designing this is any of those patients. And it's hard, and when we do involve patients, sometimes it's one or two, and we get one or two opinions. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges in research, is to really make an effort to try to understand the patient experience and what the patient wants. I think a great example is all these medication adherence apps, which are apps and devices, which everybody loves because it's something that pharma companies can fund and get behind, and it's all based on the premise that people forget to take their medicines, that in general, oh yeah, I'd love to take them, but I just forgot. And I think that, and some studies have shown that's not true. People like to forget to take their medicines because they don't like being reminded they have hypertension, or they have COPD, or they have hyperlipidemia. Medicines that can, and I can't remember who said it now, but it was a great thing that there's a difference between vitamins and painkillers. So the painkiller idea, if an app's a painkiller, then people will do that. But if it's just a vitamin that makes things easier, it'll be forgotten. So anyway, keep in mind Steve Jobs. He did pretty well for himself with this philosophy, so I think we can too. All right, the other thing important to remember as you go and talk to clinicians who want to do stuff is that the evidence of the benefit of mHealth interventions are scarce, and they're not always recognized as being needed. So a lot of the great mHealth technologies being developed are being commercialized. We're good and bad with that. And there's this is a quote I like from Economy, from a Rock Health managing director. Rock Health is a big incubator for mobile health technologies. I'm not in support of delaying access to massive improvements over the status quo. So they've got mobile health, massive improvements. So why do we need to do a study to satisfy academic criteria? And this really stood out because actually this was a response to a quote I had earlier where I was kind of saying that mHealth has a little bit too much pilot study data where if you go to an mHealth meeting, people are standing up and saying, if you use our app, you decrease readmissions by 40% or you save lives by 200% or just insane numbers based on pilot studies, uncontrolled studies of less than 10 people and expect that to change practice. And so you have to know when you're going in there that even though these are great ideas, the evidence is really limited. These are just 3 meta-analyses that have been in the last several years that all conclude the same thing. High quality, adequately powered trials of optimized interventions are required. The paucity of evidence calls for much needed future research. High quality trials measuring clinical outcomes are needed. So these to me are 3 of the best evidence-based looks at mobile health since 2013, and I don't think anything's changed since 2013 to change this. So we've got other studies have looked at it. Interestingly, 93% of all studies published in health IT in general, that includes mobile health, have positive conclusions. Yet when you really look at the data strongly, you've got this lack of data. So just realize that. I'm a big believer. I think this is the future of medicine. In fact, I know this is the future of medicine. And so the lack of data doesn't mean that we're doing something wrong or focused wrong. I'll get to how we can do things better. But just realize as you kind of sell this, because you tend to get in our own bubble and decide this is great, everybody, this is such a wonderful solution, that we're kind of coming from a place of a lack of evidence and we need to keep that in mind. The next thing, important guiding principle, is to realize that changing clinical practice is probably much harder than any of you think. So here's a quick question for the audience. So what's the average lag time between a definitive publication of a new technology in medicine and its uptake by half of the population that it applies to? 30 years. Yeah, man, no negative. 17 years. It's probably a little bit better than this now, but this is the one study that's looked at 17 years. That's generational, right? So that means that these are the doctors who have died off, and now the new ones who learned this study have come on, because this is only for half the population to get it. And let me show you something. So I'm a cardiologist, and I'll show you this. So one of the best trials ever done in the world is this randomized trial called ISIS-2. It was published in 1987 that looked at, took patients having a heart attack, an ST segment elevation MI, gave them nothing, gave them aspirin, gave them streptokinase alone, a thrombolytic drug, or the combination of that. I'm going to focus just on the aspirin. So getting aspirin decreased mortality by about 25%. There's very few things we do in medicine today, especially in cardiology, that decreases mortality by 25%. There's almost nothing in medicine today as cheap as aspirin. Aspirin had been available for well over 80 years by the time they did this study. So there can't be a simpler intervention to implement into practice, right? Saving lives, cheap, inexpensive, easy to give, all easy. In the United States, 9 years after this was published, still 25% of the population was not getting an aspirin in the setting of an acute MI. There is no logical explanation for that. And if you completely appreciate that, and realize it just, because there's too often where we think, I have a great idea, clinicians will just jump all over this will be easy, it'll take off organically, everybody will be all over it. It just doesn't work. And to be fair, this was a slow tail, but in 1990, so 3 years after the publication, half of the US population was getting aspirin. So much quicker than the 17 years, but still, why wasn't it just a week? Something like aspirin, saving a life, and so you have to keep this in mind. This isn't an artifact of 20 years ago. It's still the same today. We practice in a way that the way we trained and that we're used to, and any kind of change is very difficult to implement. And I'll get into some of the things for that. Here's just another historical example. Here's an example of a technology that'll ever come into general use, notwithstanding its value is extremely doubtful because its beneficial application requires much time and gives a good bit of trouble to the practitioner and the patient. This was a foreword to the discussion of the first stethoscope back in the 1800s. So we have a several century kind of history of being resistant to any new technologies. And it's hard to completely appreciate those who aren't in clinical practice, but this is the challenge that you face, and it's important to be realistic about it as you design trials and you work with clinicians to bring those trials to the forefront. Here's a key term, and because I think it's a term that will kill any clinical study you develop, and that's it will only take a couple of minutes per patient. And you can't imagine how often I hear that. So let's look at I'll focus on a primary care or just the general mindset of physicians. These are data from a recent survey. In general, physicians are unsatisfied with their careers. When asked, clinicians describe their morale as, 80% of physicians describe their morale as poor to very poor. 2/3 would not recommend a young adult go into the medical field, and 1/3, if given the opportunity, would get out of healthcare completely. So that's the environment you're dealing with. The biggest issue that physicians have, or what they miss most, or the most satisfying part that they miss most, is the doctor-patient relationship. On face value, almost every physician will think, oh my God, you're going to have your patients do everything at home with their smart device. That's going to ruin this doctor-patient relationship even more. So there's kind of a negative sense about it already. So when you come to them with the world's greatest app, it's important to recognize that they may not look at it as a really positive thing for their experience. Also, when you look at time and what you want to do, every day a patient has about 10 minutes of face-to-face time with patients. That explains why they're not thrilled with anything else that takes away from that. But if you look at the average primary care provider and their average clinic panel of patients they have to see, that it would take anywhere between 11 to 18 hours daily for a primary care provider just to provide the preventative and chronic disease management required of a typical patient complement. Right? So the way I think of it, every day when a physician goes home, or most physicians when they go home, and I don't mean this to sound whiny and stuff, it's just really important to recognize when, because it happens way too often, to say, oh, just add a minute to your day, that's no problem. That most physicians will go home feeling like they haven't done everything that they're supposed to do. Studies have shown that when a physician has a question when they're seeing a patient in clinic, 70% of the time they never answer that question. Like a question to themselves, gee, I wonder what the best dose is, I wonder what the right medication is. 70% of the time that question is never answered because they don't have time to do that. So there's a sense of going home. So I'm lucky that we have a really great head of ambulatory care at Scripps work with who's very interested in doing novel things, and we've met several times, and one of the first times we met and talked about it, he goes, I'm really supportive of this, I want this to happen, but realize I don't have a spare second during the day. And that's really true, and if you keep that in your back of your mind when you're designing trials and working with clinicians, I think that'll take you a long way. The other thing to keep in mind is, because we often kind of focus on okay, we'll just publish this, we'll get the publication out there, that'll change everything, everything will be okay, then clinicians will buy it and understand that. Okay, there are currently 18 million articles indexed in biomedical. The accession rate has doubled in the last 20 years, 1 million articles in 2012, so 1 million articles. To read everything of potential importance to a primary care doctor, they estimate require reading about 7,287 articles a month. So if they spend 2 minutes on every article, that'd be about 12 hours a day of reading. All right, so there's no way that clinicians are keeping up on the data, which probably goes back to that 17-year lag on new things coming up. It's too difficult to tell. Even if they read every New England Journal and every JAMA and every Lancet, only the higher tiered articles, they're still not going to be able to keep up and require that. And even when they do read it, most physicians are a little confused by it anyways. 75% have difficulty understanding statistics, even harder if you bring in genomics, or even a higher percentage not understanding. So this enters into both the time factor, so having time to read and stay current, as well as when you want to roll your solution out and being able to say, oh, well, we have this great publication and that should be enough to do it. There's challenges to that. So the key questions, I have two key questions. In what system of care will the study be carried out? And that's one of the most important transitions I guess I've had mentally in the last 2 years since focusing purely on digital medicine, is that I see as the people who are really innovative in pushing this are not healthcare systems, and in fact they're these consumer-centric companies. And so this is a nice PricewaterhouseCoopers article. The $2.8 trillion U.S. healthcare industry is being upended by companies attuned to the needs and desires of empowered customers. And some of the best examples, my second quote in here, and normally just because somebody's a politician doesn't give them great credibility in my mind, but this guy, Rick Scott, is governor of Florida, was also the founder of Columbia Hospital Corporation and then CEO of Columbia HCA, so he understands healthcare. And I think this is a real telling quote, is how many businesses do you know want to cut their revenue in half? That's why healthcare won't change the healthcare system. And that's really, healthcare systems, we're thrilled that rate of rise of healthcare costs is only in single digits, whereas from a national standpoint, really need healthcare costs to be cut in half. And that's why the biggest drivers, at least in folks we interact with, are coming from outside of healthcare system. CVS Health is a great example. They have over 1,500 locations of these minute clinics or in-house clinics across the country that's staffed by nurse practitioners and physician assistants. They've had over 25 million patient visits already in the minute clinics. Walgreens is another great example. They have 400, getting closer to 500 now locations and growing. They've already collected mHealth data, which very few people appreciate. They have the Balanced Rewards program. They have over 81 million patients already sending them glucose values, hypertension or blood pressure values, pulse oximetry values, steps, sleep quality, and they do it just to get buyer reward points. But that's a very easy flipping of the switch to turn that into disease management. They also have this exclusive partnership with Theranos, which many people know it's a fingerstick full labs. They have in the Phoenix area, they have the machines in their labs or in the stores where the people can eventually, if the technology works out the way Theranos promises, you can go in, you can see a practitioner, and then you can get a fingerstick blood test and get your entire chem panel and everything done right there in the lab with the results right to you. Other more out of this world, Interlopers, Walmart has announced that they want to be the #1 healthcare provider in the industry. And you imagine that, all the people that go to Walmart, a selection of folks who probably need a lot of chronic condition management, more so maybe than the general population, and they've got all those side stores, and they really envision that they can do a great job of doing this. Others include Google. They've already done some trial runs of virtual healthcare when people search for knee pain and then they get recommended to see a doctor. Facebook wants to get involved in healthcare. They're doing that with Oculus Rift and some other work they're doing. And Amazon has even explored, in a bigger way than this article suggests, getting into healthcare and providing that in a virtual way. So when you think about your solutions, we just ignore them because most of us are at academic centers that are associated with healthcare systems, and we think this is where healthcare is going to be changed. I just challenge you to think outside of that and realize that there's a lot of drivers, especially for chronic condition management and simple acute disease diagnostics, that's going to, I think, be driven primarily by non-legacy healthcare providers and people who we don't think of as usual healthcare providers. And then the final key question, I'd say, is really what you're studying. Ask yourself the question, are you studying how mHealth fits into current systems of care? Which I'd say is what the majority of well-done mHealth trials have done so far, is saying, okay, right now the primary care doctor does this, so we're going to give them a device to measure hypertension or to help manage heart failure, and we're going to see how that works. And in the really well-done studies, which have been primarily done in Europe, they've shown no difference. And I think the reason is that the better way to think of this is using mHealth to change systems of care that take advantage of these mHealth technologies. And the best example I'll give is this historical example of the transition from the steam engine to the electric dynamo. Right? It took 40 years to see any increase in productivity when the electricity was a power source was available. And the reason is that factories were designed around steam engines, and as you get further away from steam engines, you lose power. So in factories, that anything that needed a lot of power was built around the steam engine. So it was above it, below it, next to it. It wasn't based on like an assembly line technique or that whatever process had to be done would follow a logical way. And so even when electricity came available, they put the electricity, the dynamo, right in the center, and they put everything around it. And it took 40 years, and actually it was the auto industry at the assembly lines and the tobacco industry that were the first to kind of take advantage of what electricity could do, and that took 40 years. So people took this great technology and they didn't change their systems of manufacturing, and it took a long time then to see the benefit of electricity. And it's the same in healthcare. If we don't redesign our systems, I think, to take advantage of these mobile technologies, that we're not going to really see their full impact on their productivity. So what kind of research would utilize experts like you? I think any interventional research, in particular, that's hoping to influence clinical care, you really have to, I think, interact with clinicians. Why should researchers work with experts like me? I need the funding. I have a daughter at USC. That's the main reason. But secondly, I really think, and not just like me, but if there's nothing more important than having a clinician champion. And that means not just a clinician who's part of your team who says, sure, yeah, you can do that here in my clinic, I'm happy to do that. I mean, you want a clinician champion who's really as enthusiastic about your solution as you are. And that's going to make the difference between what may be an awesome study on paper that's well-funded and everybody's enthusiastic about, and a very successful study that can truly change practice and take it to the next level. So any study that you develop that has that clinical involvement, make sure to have a clinician champion involved. All right. So I have 3 case studies examples, and these aren't perfect, but I think they're just examples of studies we're doing at Scripps that we hope can help change practice and use 5 minutes? 5 seconds? Okay, we're good. All right, so I won't go through the details of the studies. This mSToPS is a 6,000 person study. I'm very excited about it because it's true digital medicine. We're in partnership with Aetna, where all the patient identification is using Aetna claims data. The long-term outcomes is going to be Aetna claims data, so we don't have to have all the recruitment. It's nationwide, but it's just a single center, Scripps. It's for screening for atrial fibrillation in a high-risk population. We're using a heart rhythm patch, in this case the Zio patch. And then we're also using a wristband device that measures pulse waveforms just as an exploratory trial. And we just want to see if we can identify atrial fibrillation better than standard of care in this population. We think we can. We'll just have to see how well we can do that. But when this is done, we think can really change practice and show that you can carry out clinical trials. So everything is done digitally, informed consent, information about the trial, everything digital, and all communications nationwide through using digital technology. And as I mentioned, patient identification and outpoints. The PIVOT trial is a study looking at visual changes at home. It uses this My Vision Track app. Probably the most interesting thing about the trial is we're trying to recruit patients just via the web. So basically, if you were to Google search macular degeneration, you might get an advertisement on the side saying, oh, are you interested in a trial? And we're doing that for an elderly, visually impaired population. So what a great learning case this is to see how many patients you can get recruited that way. And then we want to see, instead of the routine of going to your ophthalmologist's office and getting visual exams, at a set schedule of every 8 weeks or 6 weeks, depending on that, but you can actually track your own vision at home and identify any important changes or lack of changes by just using this app at home. It's another interesting part of it is see if we can get ophthalmologists to volunteer data without actually being part of the trial. And then this final study, I'm just going to highlight because it has this, one of the, I think, great potentials for mobile health technology is in low resource areas. This is a picture in Sierra Leone around the Ebola epidemic. This is a village setting. This is the village healer there, and this is a young lady who's got a fever that turned out not to have Ebola, but they were worried about it, so this is the norm. And what I think, you look at this and you think this is relatively primitive, but if you look really closely, you see these guys there with their smartphones. in the back. And I think this shows you how you can really leapfrog this lack of resources if you can take advantage of the technology that's out there and connected, that you can really bring several generations of better health care than is currently available. We just carried out this study in an Ebola treatment unit where it's difficult to see that these 3 patients are wearing a patch on their sternum. This is a multiparametric vital sign monitoring patch. So normally these gentlemen are the unbelievably dedicated healthcare workers who are necessary to take vital signs, and they can just do it now remotely with this patch, sending the vital sign information wirelessly to the green zone. And then we collect the data and develop an automated alerting system. So this is my contact information. Love to talk to all of you. This is a picture of where I get to work, which is really great. And since Wendy shamelessly plugged the Wireless Health Conference, let me shamelessly plug our conference, because Wendy's going to be speaking there, Donna's going to be speaking there, and it'll be fun at the Scripps Oceanographic Institute. Thank you.
All right.